All right, so it is time to officially start this part of the project, which is bringing this guy back to life, which part of that involves tearing him apart. So, first time pulling one out, so hopefully it doesn't go with too much of an issue. The Mazda documentation is really interesting because they're really, really efficient with how they do it, but because they're so efficient, it, like, is oversimplified, so I guarantee that half of what's on there, like, it just says, like, remove this line, and then it'll be like, oh, well, how do we remove it? Cool. And then we'll have to do some looky-loo and a bunch of other stuff, but like I said, we're going to go ahead and start the poll, and we'll see how far we get today. We're probably going to get the lion's share of what we need to get done on Saturday. This is Tuesday. But, we'll see what all we can get away with pulling off today. So yeah, the WRX is officially ready. All right, cool. So that did not, that wasn't too bad at all. So obviously, as you guys would have seen in the time lapse, I realized that the hood, or rather, actually, Jacob already knew, but the hinges on the hood, they don't go up very high before they hit a stop point. That's as high as they go. So that's why we had to take off the hood, because we're gonna try the official, like, Honda service manual bit has you drop the subframe with the engine and trans, but since we don't have a lift or anything that would give us the height advantage in order to pull that off, we're gonna pull it out through the front. Now, whether or not we're able to do that with the trans connected, I don't know. We'll end up having to do it one of two ways. We're either gonna be able to just take the whole engine and then basically disconnect the trans from the chassis, leave it connected to the engine, and then pull the engine and trans out this way, and then basically we'll lift it up, tilt it, lift it up, tilt it, lift it up, tilt it, until this whole thing is basically going like vertical almost, and then we'll be able to pull it all out together. Or what we may end up having to do is we may end up having to instead disconnect the trans underneath the car, pull it out, drop it onto the floor, just there underneath the car, and then we'll be able to pull out the engine without any issues because it's like as wide as a child's backpack. So that being said, everything else you saw was just disconnected a bunch of hoses. I'm trying something new. It's a little bit more work because you actually have to keep track of your numbers. Actually, you know what? I just realized something we can do. I'm going to grab a separate pen so that we know what number we're on like the back of those pages we'll write, so that way we know the next number is 7, 8, 9, 10. That way we don't end up doubling up on numbers. But basically we're just labeling all of our hoses with a number, and then wherever it connects to on whatever part also gets that number. So that way when we're putting it all back together, we know which one goes where. Most of it's pretty self-explanatory right now because everything is like a bespoke size or a bespoke fitment / location. But it's one of those things that really helps, especially like on the S2000, it's got a plethora of freaking vacuum hoses that are identical, and you have no way to tell what goes where, which is why I actually have an intake from one of my other engines that I leave intact so I can see where all the vacuum lines go and reference it later. If I go, where does this go? I just pull it out from the basement and look at it. So, but yeah, so basically, goal is we just take out everything in front of here. So we're right now following the factory guide that I printed out there. But basically what we're likely going to end up doing is moving a bunch of these wiring harnesses around, disconnecting them from the engine. Right now we're draining the coolant, which, by the way, fun fact, I didn't know this. Jacob knew it, but I didn't know it. These are actually V-mounted from the factory. Like, it's not like a crazy full-blown V-mount, but like the radiator, you can see, is at a slant. So, and the actual drain bolt at the bottom of it is actually really cool because it's just like a plastic screw. So you literally stick a Phillips up in there and you turn it until coolant comes out. And that is even like at an angle, so it goes straight down. So by the way, this is probably like my WRX, the spatchcock drains onto the subframe. S2000 spatchcock drains onto the subframe because, you know, F me. But this, whew, I was able to put my pan under. This is almost the clean, like, if it wasn't for the fact that I disconnected a hose ahead of time and got stuff on my face afterwards, this would almost be like a perfectly clean coolant drain. So like I said, more things to like about the RX-8. So that being said, we're going to go ahead and finish letting this coolant drain, and then after that, the next step is to just start disconnecting all of the hoses that connect to the motor. The other thing that's kind of fun is, again, because of that placement, like, you've got the power steering rack there, but for all intents and purposes, you don't even have to pull the radiator to get the engine out. Like, there's so many things in this car that can stay in place while you're doing a motor pull that it's like, I mean, honestly, it just, in theory, makes things really simple. So yeah, so we're just going to chill out. We're going to get the coolant swapped out, or not swapped out, we're going to get the finished draining the coolant, pull the motor, and then once we pull the motor, or not pull the motor, we're going to disconnect more things, because we need to disconnect more things. Pretty soon I'm going to go under the car and start actually disconnecting all of the transmission-y bits and disconnecting the drive shaft and the power plant frame that connects the transmission to the rear differential. And then once we get all that stuff disconnected, then we'll be closer to where we need to be in order to get this disconnected. So yeah, stay tuned. Alright, so I apologize. The other camera went dead because I didn't have the foresight to plug it into a charger and keep it running. So that being said, you guys didn't miss a whole ton. Only thing you missed in time-lapse action really was me undoing this wiring harness from the ECU, which the ECU on this car is stored in this little watertight box. If you're doing this yourself, be careful. There are 2 bolts that hold this part in, but then there's 2 clips. Like, you can kind of see the tab for it back there, but basically, long story short is these used to be closed rectangles. I broke them off because I was kind of in a hurry, and we don't care a ton about this car. So if you're doing that, be really careful, and you, like, folding it up is just gonna break those tabs. So don't try and just like 90-degree angle tilt it, because that'll break it. So I would recommend a lot of patience with like a tiny pry bar or some sort of pick where you can really grab into it and pop those off. So, you know, if you intend on putting a car back together long term and making it nice, then make sure you do that. So basically on our, that's the AC compressor right there. On ours, it's the bolts that go into the irons were pretty much completely seized in place. They turned, but the top 2, which are obviously the ones that are the driest, those popped loose. The bottom 2 were not nearly as compliant. So with the bottom 2, I turned one and it started to go, and then eventually I just ended up snapping the bolt off. And same thing with the other one. I turned it and it got further out before it snapped. And the annoying thing about that is that this space is cramped. So basically, normally if you can take the bolts out, the AC compressor can then, from where it's at, go up and down and forward and back and not have any issues with moving around. Whereas when you have bolts that are broken off in there, like when the heads are broken off, they act as studs, and you have to be able to pull the AC compressor a certain distance one way or the other in order to get it off. Well, one of mine is super long, so couldn't get it quite off. And on top of that, the whole thing, it was bound up because those bolts, again, were kind of grody. So when I pried, like, basically the AC compressor wouldn't slide on those bolts at all. I actually had to take my biggest pry bar, hold on, yeah, this long one right here, and basically just wedge it into that gap and just go gorilla on it. And I managed to get it to pop loose, But the downside is that this AC compressor, one of the mounting, basically there's just 4 channels where the bolts go through. Well, yeah, one of those channels actually broke. Like the actual casting part broke off. So it's got a little bit where the bolt can go through. But long story short is again, I'm glad that this isn't a long-term car, because otherwise I would have to get a new AC compressor. Because, well, it'll work. You'll have 3 out of the 4 bolts. So to be honest, I probably wouldn't have to. But it's just, again, for quality of work wise, like if this was a like a customer car where I wanted to get it back to them in as good a condition as possible, then basically, yeah, they'd be getting a new compressor, which is more money than what would have been intended for what's happening. So it's just like, again, I probably would have done something slower. Sorry, my arm's getting tired. I'm gonna switch hands. Yeah, if this, I would have taken a lot more time and been a lot more careful in a different project. But all right, anyway, I'm repeating myself. So long story short is it was that. So AC compressor is free. I didn't pull it up and out because I just decided it wasn't worth the effort to snake it around. But it is disconnected from the motor. Got all of the hoses on this side disconnected, and basically on paper, everything except for a handful of connectors, which I'll figure that out later. Everything except for a handful of connectors is disconnected. So basically for Saturday, it should just be getting under the car, removing the slave cylinder and just a bunch of random bolts and wires and connectors and all sorts of other stuff from under the car, and then we should be good to go ahead and try and pull this motor out. So like I said, hopefully we're kind of on schedule, and it'll be kind of nice because it'll be almost in record time, because we got it to this point in about 4 hours. And then we'll hopefully get the motor and trans out in another 4. So it'll just be like, an 8-hour job to get out, which, a shop that knows what they're doing could do it even faster. But the other thing too is it's an older car. Like, I had to bust out a lot of they're really easy tricks. So for any of you guys who are new to working on cars, this may be helpful to you. For any of you guys who have been working on cars for a while, it's like, no duh. But like, I did a lot of, for hoses that are old, and, for old hoses and stuff that are really stuck on there. Basically, for the hose clamp itself, if you spray a little WD-40 on it, then when you actually go to undo the clamp, it'll actually slide down the hose a lot easier, so you won't murder your fingers trying to do it on a dry hose. So remember, kids, always use lube. And then there's other tools, like, again, anyone who's worked on cars knows what this is, but anyone who hasn't, you might not. This is a hose plier tool. Basically, it's a wrench, or it's like a little plier thing on a cable. And this is really hard to show, but like, basically, I'm gonna try and do this with one hand. Let's see. I'm gonna set that there. So basically, when you squeeze the handles, you can see those jaws actually close, and it locks in place in the position that you put it in. So basically, the advantage of that is that you can wrap it around these little, these generic hose clamps. These are worm ones. Yeah, you can wrap it around like hose clamps like this, and it holds it shut. So then you're free to move it with your hands without having to worry about doing 2 things at once. Heat helps too. So if you have a hose that, after you've taken the hose clamp off, if the hose does not want to come off the barb, you can actually use like a heat gun, or I don't recommend using other sorts of heat, but use like a heat gun or some sort of source of heat, and you can actually soften up the hose a little bit to get it off. In this car's case, we were able to do most of it just by using hose pliers, which is another tool I didn't know existed for years until I got them like 2 or 3 years ago. But these little guys, basically, they're angled, and they have these little circles at the end, and basically you just put whatever matches the outer diameter of your hose, or you use whichever one matches the outer diameter of your hose, and then it actually gives you that option so you can twist the hose and get that seal to crack so that it'll actually start to want to slide back and forth. Just like I said, a lot of little tools that help make things go a lot easier and a lot less frustrating. That AC compressor took a stupid amount of my time. Just because, again, those bolts didn't want to play nice. One of them, I couldn't fit my ratchet in there and get the bolt loose because the ratchet was backing up against the steering knuckle, and then the ratchet almost got stuck. So I had to use a short wrench, because I don't have a really long ratcheting wrench. So that's something I need to look into, is getting some extended reach wrenches that I can actually stick on things and still have torque on them, because when a socket makes things too long, it can be a bit of a pain. But yeah, so like I said, for the most part though, this is what it looks like when it's ready to come out. So we'll undo the rest of it, and then we'll try and pull this guy out, and then the cool stuff gets to happen where we actually tear this guy apart, diagnose, what all is wrong with it, and hopefully it's just those coolant seals and apex seals and a bunch of other stuff that's easy to service, and then we'll start putting it back together. Oh, and then another quick little random trick that I started to do is that we printed out the actual shop manual. So at each step we've been marking, you can kind of see, yeah, we've been marking like different numbers and whatnot. And these numbers are the hoses and connectors. So you can kind of see right here. So I've got, this is 10. So 10, and then I marked where it goes on there, 10. So it just makes it, a lot of people do the trick where you just take a picture. That solution is wholeheartedly worth it as well. I'm personally trying to play around with new little tactics that allow me to not have to worry about like getting my phone messy, which some of you guys don't care. I care about getting my phone messy because I've got a fancy phone. But so in my case, I'm trying to do things as pen and paper / as disposable material as possible. So anyhow, babbling on and on, I'm gonna go ahead and get ready for bed because it's getting late. But yeah, good progress for today.